Dear guests, welcome to our today's seminar titled Truth and Justice, the Question of Transitional Justice for the Future of Ukraine. First, a small technical announcement. The seminar today will last about 1.5 hours. In the end, there will be a Q&A section where questions from the audience will be discussed. Therefore, if you have questions for our panelists, please write them down into the chat during the seminar. They will be read out at the end. As always, the seminar is being recorded and will be later published on the YouTube channel of the German-Ukrainian Historical Commission. I will post the link to the channel and our partner institutions to the chat after the announcement. The languages of the webinar are English and Ukrainian. We have a simultaneous translation going. If you want to hear the translation, please click on the icon with the globe at the right bottom of the screen. Thank you for your patience. Now I'll pass the word on to Natalia Khanenko-Friesen.
Thank you, Georgi. Welcome everybody from wherever you're connecting to be with us today. I'm Natalia Khanenko-Friesen. I'm connecting from Treaty 6 territory in Canada, which is also known as Alberta, Edmonton. And I am here to host the webinar seminar we are running within the series of Historians in the War, We Think in the Future. We have started this series very much immediately after the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia and Russian Federation. Ultimately, as you've noted, our seminar series are focusing on the future, and we have been gathering bright minds from around the world to reflect on what future will look like in the wake of this brutal invasion, which had grown to become a global international crisis, as we have been observing it for the last almost 2 years. Today's seminar is focusing on a very important topic, and I'm very pleased to also remind us that we are co-hosting this event together with other international partners. I am representing the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, housed at the University of Alberta here in Edmonton, but our partners are also German-Ukrainian Historical Commission, which is co-chaired by Professor Guido Hausmann and Professor German Grinchenko, each representing both countries, Germany and Ukraine. We are also partners with Ukraine-based scholarly journal Ukraina Moderna, also represented by a team, German Grinchenko being an editor-in-chief, but also Yaroslav Hrytsak, who I hope is also in the room with us, spearheading this initiative in the first place and being a founding editor of the journal. Our today's seminar is focusing mainly on how the model and the framework of transitional justice as a system of reconciliation and a system of peace building in post-conflict societies can be implemented in Ukraine. When can it be implemented in Ukraine? In what ways? And for us to focus and engage in this conversation, we thought we'll bring in some other international experts who have an expertise in broad terms and also in very focused terms. And I would like to introduce our speakers before we will give them the floor for their introductory presentations. I also would like to remind us that our introductory presentations would be within 15 minutes. Then we will have a conversation between the speakers, and then we will open up the floor for questions and answers to engage with the audience. Altogether, our seminar will last 1.5 hours, so let's be organized around those limitations. I'm very pleased to welcome Thomas Unger as the first speaker, who is an independent expert on transitional justice at the Dutch NGO Impunity Watch. He's also currently providing strategic advice on issues of international policy and transitional justice. Thomas is regularly advising various international organizations on transitional justice matters, including the United Nations, European Union, Council of Europe, and the Swiss Foreign Ministry. He has been a co-director of the Master of Advanced Studies in Transitional Justice, Human Rights, and the Rule of Law, a former senior advisor to the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the promotion of truth, justice, reparation, and guarantees of non-recurrence. Thomas worked for many years as a human rights officer within the Austrian Foreign Ministry, as well as a legal system monitor with an OSCE mission in Kosovo, and has been also a legal clerk with the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. Since 2022, he is an associate expert to the Dealing with the Past program at Swiss Peace. Thomas is a regular expert lecturer on transitional justice at the Austrian Center for Peace. I will also introduce other speakers as we go forward. And our next presenter coming from Canada will be Professor Carlson, who holds Canada Research Chair in Indigenous and Community Engaged History at the University of Fraser Valley, where he has additionally been appointed Director of the Peace and Reconciliation Center. His research is designed and executed collaboratively with Indigenous communities so as to best meet community Indigenous priorities. He's currently working closely with the Stola communities on several projects, including investigating the history of children who did not return from residential schools. His scholarship has featured prominently in efforts to recognize and operationalize Indigenous rights and title, and in working towards transitional justice. I'm also very pleased to introduce our Ukraine-based presenter today, Dr. Oksana Dovgopolova, professor at the philosophy department at the Odessa Mechnikov National University. Dr. Habilitation in Philosophy of History, co-founder and curator of the cultural memory platform, Past Future Art. The main areas of research interest of Oksana's include social reconciliation in the context of collective memory, Odessa image in memory entrepreneurship, Odessa themed restaurants out of Odessa, for example. I think that's what you're focusing on. The development of Odessa regional identity in times of Russian full-scale invasion, which had started in 2022. Dr. Dovgopolova is experienced in higher education. She has been working in public sphere. Since 2014, she has been participating in dialogue initiatives in Odessa, and since 2019, she's been curating the work of the Past Future Art Cultural Memorial Platform, which implements educational and research projects, as well as public program of activities in order to involve the general public into working through the past. From 2022, the project continues its work with a focus on commemoration of the Russia-Ukraine war. Thank you very much for joining us. I think our presenters are connecting with us from Odessa, from Geneva, from outside of Vancouver. We have the world here in the room. I would offer first the floor to Thomas. Can you please start with what you have to say, and then we'll move off to Keith and Oksana next. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me here, and it's really a great pleasure to be here and to share my thoughts with you. Just as thank you very much also for the very nice introduction, and just wanted to say that I'm not an expert on Ukraine and transitional justice. I'm also not a historian, so I'm a boring lawyer that became a bit that went outside the law, and I will speak a little bit about that. So I'm really into interdisciplinary dialogue, that's why I love this kind of forum here. But overall, as you have seen from my CV, I'm a practitioner. I've been working in various contexts of where transitional justice is relevant. I'm from Austria originally, so dealing with the past is very relevant in my own society, and I have my own history that motivates me to work on this topic. So I'm happy to share some thoughts with you. And I thought what I would love to do is, first of all, to explain in a few minutes the concept of transitional justice, just to give us a bit of an idea and the framework that is there. And then to look into implementation, because I think one question you're looking at here is, what does it mean to implement transitional justice in a context like Ukraine? And I can provide some general thoughts on how I have seen implementation in other contexts, and that might be relevant also for the Ukraine. And then I want to end with a bit of a thought about Europe and transitional justice, because I think it's really interesting to look at that dimension and not only look very far away, but look actually on our own continent and look a little bit how this continent has dealt with transitional justice or dealing with the past, or however you want to call it. Let me say a few words first on the transitional justice framework. And the transitional justice framework, how I have learned it, and I'm, as I said, a lawyer. I really come from a legal background. I worked, as you heard, with the ICTY, International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. I studied law, I engaged with the UN. It's a very normative understanding. So transitional justice transitional justice frameworks have very normative understanding. So they are very legal often, and a lot of lawyers are part of formulating this framework. And this framework has often been presented as including 4 pillars. And these 4 pillars are prosecution, some form of reparation, some form of truth-seeking, and some guarantees that there will be non-recurrence, basically, of serious violations of the past. And so it's been very mechanism-oriented. So when you talk about transitional justice frameworks, you immediately come to courts, you immediately come to truth commissions, you immediately come to reparation programs, you immediately come to constitutional reform issues. So very kind of mechanism-oriented. Transitional justice and the framework has also been very much influenced by practice, by experience, in particular the Latin American experience, the transitions to democracies in the 80s have influenced that framework, this 4-pillar framework. And they have influenced it also from the perspective of goals, not to say we want to recognize victims, we want to reestablish the rule of law. One of the claims in the Latin American context was we want to reclaim this rule of law space that basically has been taken away by authoritarian regimes. And so we want to reclaim that space. So rule of law is also a very important kind of goal here. And then also to kind of move on. We need the past in order to move on. We need to address the past in order to have a better future. So that is also like nunca más, never again. These were calls by victims, no, that are also very much there. The transitional justice framework also has been very innovative often. It has moved beyond mere criminal justice. So it included other kind of claims victims might have around recognition, around reparation, around truth-seeking. Missing persons, for example, I want to know where my loved one is also part of this transitional justice framework. In terms of context, transitional justice has been very much developed in post-conflict societies, but also in post-authoritarian societies that transitioned from authoritarian regime to a democracy, or transitioned from some form of conflict to some form of non-conflict or peace. And obviously, what we will talk about a bit later, this all gets blurred in practice. No, it all sounds nice in theory, but in practice, it's much more messy. We have found out how messy transitional justice situations are. A lot of dilemmas happen there. No, a lot of it's not a clear kind of route. No, it's not a clear kind of you do A and then you arrive at B. No, and so that's just interesting to know. But anyway, this framework I've just explained has been transformed into UN policies, has been transformed into policies of the European Union. This 4-pillar structure really is now very much acknowledged. If you would go to the UN, or if you would go to the EU, if you would go to the Council of Europe, if you would go to Latin America, if you would read case law around this, you would always find these 4 kind of areas. And they have been enriched, obviously, by different other areas. In particular, memory has come in very strongly into the transitional justice debate, and so on. But just to say that there is a certain legalistic, normative understanding of transitional justice that's out there in terms of policy frameworks and legal frameworks. What does this mean for implementation? And I want to say a few words around implementation. First of all, implementation in many contexts has been seen from this normative perspective. So it has been seen from, let's provide a remedy to a violation. Let's prosecute a crime that has happened. Let's compensate a victim. So this has been basically done in various, so the legal response in transitional justice has been very, very strong. And we see this also in the Ukraine, no? I mean, we see that the legal responses in terms of war crimes prosecutions, which came from the international community also first, is there was a lot of support around war crimes prosecutions. All this architecture that is currently built around war crimes prosecution is a reflection of how we see transitional justice, very much from let's correct these past, no, from a corrective justice perspective, not so much from a restorative justice perspective. We see it from a corrective justice perspective, as well with restitution and compensation. If you look at the discussion in Ukraine around reparations, it's mainly around compensation. The institutions that are built, also internationally, globally, a registry of damages, for example, will lead to a claims commission. So you will basically get some form of money back. No? The question around assets, the question around how to get to is all connected to some form of compensation. So this idea of how to understand transitional justice has also been applied in the Ukraine. And I'm not saying that victims are not calling for that, but also I'm looking more from the perspective of how the international community, the EU, would see, for example, transitional justice. So very, very, very legal, very mechanism focused. Less so seen are other dimensions of transitional justice, more symbolic forms, memorialization, remembrance, soft issues, so to say, no? Education. It's also could be history education, for example. No, this is not something that's really often seen first in the area of transitional justice. What's seen first is war crimes prosecution, reparation as compensation, and that's just interesting to note when we think about implementation. And I think Ukraine shows that also. And I'm not saying that it's not right to prosecute, but I'm saying that other areas of dealing with the past of transitional justice are often a bit more marginalized, or might also come later, but they are more an afterthought often at the beginning. Implementation of transitional justice or dealing with the past is also seen from many other perspectives that are currently priorities or are priorities in different post-conflict situations. There might be a priority for economic development, for stability, for security. We've seen this very much in the Balkans. For example, in the Balkans, although we had a lot of efforts around justice, at the end of the day, what trumped these justice efforts was stability. So what we see today in the Balkans is a dominance of stability. We're trying to ensure that the Serbs don't go back after the Croats, and we ensure in Bosnia that the Croats don't go back after the Bosniaks. So we stabilize in a way, even if we stabilize this with those who deny a genocide, for example. So I'm thinking that implementation also has to be seen from that perspective. Transitional justice is not immune to other areas. No, it's actually consumed by these other areas and often trumped by these other areas. And I think that's important to see. Implementation also needs to be seen from, I would say, a state or elite perspective. And again, from the Balkan perspective, what's interesting is that transitional justice becomes part of the ongoing battle. Maybe war through other means. No, and what I'm referring to here is, for example, that what I've seen in the Balkans is that the term genocide, for example, every side claims the other or blames the other for committing genocide. So the term genocide, which on paper might be the right paper, on which even courts might have declared that there is genocide, is politically abused by the elites in a country to stay in power. And denial of genocide still gets you to win votes, basically. No, and that's just interesting to also take into account when you implement transitional justice. It's going to get politicized somehow, in particular, very big terms like genocide, like crime against humanity, in particular in divided societies where we anyway know the other is always the perpetrator and we are always the victim. So that gets abused politically, and we have seen that in various contexts. And the last part I wanted to talk about around implementation is at the community level, because transitional justice is not only happening at the policy level, at the broader political level, it's happening on a daily basis, and for many generations at the community level. I mean, me as an Austrian, I can just tell you my own story. I mean, my grandparents, they were Nazis, and after the Second World War, basically, there was a complete silence in my society because there were only perpetrators left in that society, and they were sticking together, basically. And And my father never had a history education in school about the Holocaust, about what the Nazis did. I was the first generation, I was born in 1975, that received some form of history education around that. But what I saw in my own family was silence, complete silence around these topics. No? And that's interesting that there was no dealing with the past really, or no addressing of this topic at the community level. In the Balkans, I've seen this as well in divided societies, that also things change at the community level. So in the Balkans, although there have been a lot of prosecutions, there have been significant amount of prosecutions in the Balkans of war criminals, the war criminals are now coming back. They serve their sentences. They're coming back into communities where no dealing with the past has been taking place, or where the societies are still divided. So it doesn't stop with a court case. It doesn't stop with a verdict. It doesn't stop with a conviction. One needs long-term ideas and frameworks that address dealing with the past. It's not something that will be solved within a few years. It takes generations. So all these different levels would need to be connected. And this is obviously very, very challenging for policymakers, because policymakers want to deliver, they want to show, they want to produce, and this complexity doesn't fit into that kind of discussions, and these gray zones, these dilemmas, which we see at the community level around collaborators, for example, or around intergenerational trauma. These are dilemmas that are in the societies, and they're often left out or are kind of not thought about. So this is what I wanted to say a little bit about implementation. So implementation is complex, but I think we have more and more understanding, but we are not heard often because it's too complex. And so I'm thinking that's why discussion forums like this are really interesting, because one can really try to move together forward. Let me say something about Europe and transitional justice. And I started working on transitional justice always looking outside. I looked at what's going on in the DRC Congo, what's going on in Colombia, what's going on in Cambodia, what's going on, in the Middle East, And Europe, I felt immune. I said, we know everything. We have dealt with this, But actually, that's not the case. But the European Union, and me as a citizen of the European Union, I can also say so, is still very much thinking in these terms. They think transitional justice is happening elsewhere. It's not happening here in Europe. It's not happening within Hungary. It's not happening within Spain. It's not happening within Germany. It's happening elsewhere. And this is one of the big gaps, I say, that Europe doesn't have, the European Union doesn't have an internal framework, an internal kind of recipe around transitional justice, because it sees it as a foreign policy tool. And that's an interesting part when we think about the EU. Obviously, Europe is broader than the EU, and there are experiences in Europe around transitional justice. But here the picture is very mixed, I would say. Europe is not a success story around transitional justice. Look at again at the Balkans. We had early, very much efforts around justice, with the establishment of international tribunals, with a lot of funding and political efforts going into that. If you look at the Balkans today, and if you follow this today, the EU has very, very little to offer around transitional justice in the accession discussions, for example. Look at Spain, look at Northern Ireland. These are very much cases that haven't been resolved. Or are very, there are still transitional justice issues there. So that's not cases where you say, wow, it has been resolved. Or even moving into issues of colonialization. I was at the meeting very recently in Geneva, organized by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And we heard a testimony from a Sami representative in Sweden. And I couldn't believe what I heard about basically the violations, the discrimination, the oppression that took place in these kind of contexts. We know very little about this. And it changes a little bit because the colonial past is more and more on the agenda. I think now we see in the European Parliament currently an initiative that also tries to establish some form of reparative forum to talk about the colonial past. But I would say we are very much at the beginning, and the discussions around the internal questions around transitional justice in Europe are not well organized. So my argument would be that I think the Russian aggression in Ukraine and the transitional justice questions that come out of that hit Europe very cold-feeted. I think Europe doesn't have a plan. It has a very legalistic idea about what transitional justice is, but it doesn't have a broader understanding, because we never had a coordination around this. We don't have a framework around this in Europe. So Europe has very little to offer, I would say, in this context. So a new framework is needed. I think a European framework is needed. And I think the discussions together with our Ukrainian friends could maybe help around this. And I think they would help if we not take a geographical idea about, let's say, this is Ukraine, it's in the East. If we take a cultural dimension to transitional justice in Europe. And what do I mean by that? And I was rereading a book by Milan Kundera. You probably know him. He's a Czech intellectual who wrote already back in the 90s about the idea of Central Europe. And Central Europe is a cultural space that ranged from Riga to beautiful Odessa. There is a cultural understanding of values in that region that needs to be reclaimed, because that understanding has been erased after the First World War. It has been oppressed by the Soviet Union. The soul has been taken out by the Holocaust. It has been distorted on the Western side by turbo capitalism of Western countries. But there's still an idea of what it means, what values means, what culture means, that needs to be reclaimed. And I think this is an idea transitional justice in Europe could reclaim. So there is a legal dimension, but I'm thinking there's also a very strong cultural dimension. And in order to get to that dimension, and I'm not an expert on that, I just have a feeling for that, we need interdisciplinary dialogues. Is it the right time to talk about this? Because as one of the authors I've been reading with passion, Sergei Sardan, you probably know him, an Ukrainian author, he says that among many other great things he says is that in war, colors change, and there's no there are no gray shades of gray anymore. Everything is black and white. So my main question is, how can we, and when is the right time to bring back these gray areas that are so important for effective transitional justice, that is lasting, that can basically help future generations to live a better life? So I would like to end here with that question, because I don't have an answer to that question myself, but I hope I could at least sketch out a little bit what's out there and bring in some of my own ideas, which are still very vague. But that's why we're here to discuss.
Thank you so much, Thomas, for offering us such a great context for the conversation to follow. I'm asking Keith now to step in and reflect on Canada.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me here to be part of this conversation. I'm coming to you today from just outside of Vancouver, British Columbia, and this is the homeland of the Stalo communities who have lived here since time immemorial, and who face ongoing settler colonial pressure and oppression within their territories. And so that's largely how the lens that I'm using when it comes to thinking of transitional justice. I would like to, I guess, start by saying my own ancestors were part of a colonial process in Ukraine. As far as I can tell, my ancestors came from, my German ancestors came from the Swiss-German, what is now the Swiss-German kind of border region, and then were part of a process. They were Catholic Germans, and they moved to a small village just outside of what's now Lviv. My ancestors lived there for roughly a century on land that was where they had displaced Ukrainian people, people who were indigenously from that space. They relocated to Canada in the late 19th century, where they were part of the process of displacing Indigenous people from the Canadian prairies, from their lands and resources. And then myself have moved out now to British Columbia with my parents and grandparents before me. And this is a process of my family plopping themselves down into another people's territory through the authority of a state apparatus that was not necessarily consultative or cooperative in any way with the Indigenous people who lived occupied on and used those lands. And so that's the context that I'm coming from. And I feel that what we're dealing with in settler colonial societies like Canada, I think like the United States, Australia, New Zealand, like Israel, and many other parts of the world where this could be pointed to, we're dealing with what I refer to as the conundrum of double permanence. The conundrum of double permanence. We, regardless of what anybody may have thought 100, 200 years ago on either side of the colonial divide, about who would be here in 150 years, like who would be here today. Regardless of that, both sides are here today, and both sides have no intention of leaving. This is home now to people. Settler Europeans in Canada have ancestors now for multiple generations buried in this land. They feel Canada is their home, or the United States, or wherever that might be. They don't have a place to go home to. I can't return to Germany, where one side of my family's ancestors are from. I have no connection to that site. So what I need to do as a settler Canadian is to find ways to build a new and respectful relationship with the Indigenous people upon whose lands I live and whose lands and resources my society, my British Western Canadian society, has exploited and continues to exploit. Under settler colonialism, the objective, so unlike, say, the British who go into India, right, where the desire in the 19th century was to harness the labor of the people living in the Indian subcontinent in a retooled economy around cotton and then to extract that wealth back to England. In a settler colonial society, Indigenous people's labor is not a prime concern at all. In fact, it's simply the land and resources. And so what the settler colonial state wants to do is move in and displace Indigenous people from their land and resources, and then to replace them on to that land. And so in Canada and similar other Western settler colonial states, we have Indian reserves. They're still referred to that way, Indigenous reserves, where Indigenous people live in economic marginal lives. They don't have meaningful self-governance over themselves or their traditional territories. And they are subjected to racial prejudice and bigotry and gendered oppression. And so in our society in Canada, we've a couple of times sought to bring in these large sort of apparatus, state legal apparatus of the kind Thomas was just mentioning, where we had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that focused on the residential school history and its legacy of trauma for Indigenous people. And we've had more recently a Royal Commission examining the tragic story, the ongoing tragic story of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and people of non-binary gendered lives. In both those cases, both of those have done some wonderful things, those commissions. They've achieved certain goals. They've raised awareness and consciousness. They've done good things. But neither of them has sought to or had the mandate to examine that larger settler colonial problem, and that is Indigenous people no longer having governance over their land and governance over their own bodies. That to me is what is essential to any form of transitional reconciliation, transitional or healing that will lead us to a new future. Residential schools in Canada, oftentimes they're framed, these are schools where we know that at least 150,000 students were taken from their parents, taken from their families and communities, and placed into schools distant from their homes, where they were educated by usually Roman Catholic, Methodist, or Anglican missionaries and nuns, to convert them into Christians, into Catholics and Protestants, and to integrate, assimilate them into Western society. And we also know that these schools were places where horrible abuses took place, physical abuses, sexual abuses, and of course, cultural abuse, the denial, the displacement of people's sense of who they are and their language. We're trying in some ways to deal with that in Canada, but from my perspective, not effectively, not in a comprehensive manner. What we're doing is we're going back and we're trying to say this particular aspect was wrong-headed, was illegal, was even atrocious in some places, and that is all good. It's moving in the right direction. It's little pieces, but it is all happening within this legal framework of the Canadian Constitution, British common law, that does not take into account the displacement of Indigenous people, and how, in fact, that process, the process of meeting with Indigenous people, establishing relations with Indigenous people, and then negotiating treaties with Indigenous people in Canada, that process has never lived up to British common law expectations and now Canadian constitutional law expectations. It has been done in the past. The negotiations where they took place, and they didn't take place all over Canada, were rushed, were pressured, took place when Indigenous people were at their most vulnerable point after the bison herds had been destroyed and depleted, after salmon resources had been reallocated to large corporate interests on the West Coast, this sort of thing. So they weren't meaningful treaties where Indigenous people had real ability to say, here's what we would want out of this relationship. Here's what we would refuse to give up in this relationship. And principally, the problem there was that Canada had no intention of changing who it was. The Canadian Settler Society had no intention of saying, in this negotiation, we are becoming something different. It's all about you becoming something different. We will negotiate with you, as in we will give you these things. We will let you retain these little tiny things, but we expect you to change, to become part of our society, to integrate into our society. Whereas we will not change. We do not see a benefit to having your culture, your language, your ways of knowing and governance part of our culture. So that's the fundamental core of a settler colonial state that we're living with. And in Canada, the various commissions have tried to look into this. But if you look at residential schools, the physical and sexual cultural abuse that took place there has received attention appropriately. And people have often framed this in terms of racism, racialization. That is true, but that racialization was done as a handmaiden service to the settler colonial displacement of Indigenous people. We can look to places like Central Europe and other places to see that you don't have to have a different color skin, North Ireland, to be the victim of a settler colonial disposition and colonization. So race becomes sort of a rationale for the displacement of Indigenous people and the denying of their rights and their title. And it's mobilized in that way. Residential schools were sites where young Indigenous rights and title holders under the Canadian Constitution were meant to be transitioned into simply another racialized ethnic minority at the bottom rung of Canada's economic and social order. That's what residential schools were meant to do. That was their goal. And on top of that, they did a whole bunch of other horrible things, crimes that we can prosecute. But that's what their goal was. And that's the goal of displacing and erasing Indigenous people. Now, I know we have to be tight here and things. So how do we move forward? Some of these legal structures definitely have to be followed. We need to live up to rules of law in the sense that Canada has laws, constitutional laws and common laws that were never lived up to during the negotiation or the implementation of treaties and other policies towards Indigenous people. That has to happen. But even if that happened to the best ability that it could, it's only half of the story. We have not yet even begun to contemplate how do Indigenous laws, Indigenous ways of knowing genuinely transform Canada into a different place, a place that would be perhaps largely unrecognizable to many of the settlers who have moved here, because it would be one that values Indigenous ways of seeing, knowing, and being. That's difficult. In Canada, to the extent that we've dealt with transitional justice in the past, it's largely been in the context of the British Canadians' conquest of and occupation of and control of Quebec, the French Canadian situation, where there has been sort of a swaying back and forth within political parties between French leaders and English leaders, where there have been notions about transitional realpolitik within Canada, about making sure that Quebec gets certain things and Western Canada gets certain things as a balance. But none of that is meaningful transitional justice, to my way of thinking. Canadian, and I'll try to wrap up here. I know I've only have about a few minutes for this. I think nation states are mutable. We know that nation states are mutable. Nation states are not permanent in terms of where their physical boundaries are, or even whether they exist. We see them come and go. And yet when they exist, nobody in those states really thought they would ever leave or ever change. They seem so militarily powerful, culturally powerful, and economically powerful. But that isn't the case. So if I were to lay bets, if someone were to ask me, in 100 years, will there be a Canadian state with its current boundaries and its current governance system? I would say possibly, hopefully not in some ways, but hopefully not in the sense that it turns into a destructive civil war and people are being killed. But I think there's a really good chance Canada won't have the same boundaries it currently has and the same governance system. And that's even separate from the issue of whether Quebec, the French-Canadian part of Canada, separates. If I were to ask the Indigenous people of any territory of this country, in 100 years, will you, the Stalo people, the Cree people, the Anishinaabe people, in 100 years, will you be here? And will you know where your boundaries of your territory are? And will you have a culture that enables you to see and govern your land and resources and yourselves in a meaningful way that your ancestors would recognize? And I know, guaranteed, they would say yes. They absolutely would, despite the incredible forces of assimilation and displacement that have been brought to bear on their ancestors and that continue to exist within a settler colonial state. And for me, that gives hope. I think that gives hope. And I don't think most Canadians have bought into a settler Canadian state in a conscious way. We live it passively because that is simply what is here. And I think there are some exciting opportunities for us to begin to decolonize Canada in meaningful ways that would create a new Canada, where rather than seeing Indigenous people and their histories as minor bit players who resisted aspects of our national development, we would invert that paradigm so that we begin to see Canada as existing within multiple Indigenous histories, and all of the implications of that would be a Canada that was different than it currently is today. It would inherently, necessarily be different than it is today. That's about giving up power in some important and real ways. That's about contributing to Indigenous resurgence so that they can assert and claim that space, intellectual space, economic space, cultural space, governance space, while pulling away from that space for the settler colonial society. That doesn't mean that settler colonists suddenly become oppressed people, which is the fear you hear sometimes, especially from the right. What that means is that the current benefits that Canada has and Canadian citizens have will now be reconstituted in ways that are equitable to Indigenous people, and the insights and benefits that would come from Indigenous people having meaningful control of their land and resources would now be shared. Right? So this is a win-win situation. It doesn't need to be a transactional, we take from you in order for you to gain something on that side. But there is a redistribution of power, and there has to be a resurgence of Indigenous power. But I don't see that as fundamentally threatening to settler colonial individuals, although it is threatening to the settler colonial state. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Keith, very much for your insightful comments and commentary. We will ask Oksana Dovgopolova. Professor Dovgopolova, please bring us to Ukrainian case.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for invitation. It's really a great talk, and it's very important to share our experiences. And maybe I will try to go from my own perspective. I work with the topic of transitional justice from 2014. And immediately after the tragic events of 2nd of May in Odessa, when 48 people were killed in street battles, I took part in the dialogue initiatives of Odessa Regional Center of Mediation. And we understood, when we understood that we need to sue the city was splitted absolutely. And before 2014, I was a person from university. It was all right for me to sit in audience, and I didn't see the outer world. And in 2014, I understood that I'm historian. In my first life, I'm historian. And I see that historical knowledge is used as weapon. And I did nothing in this situation. I saw these efforts, I saw these lie, I saw these instruments, and I thought it's not very important. It's that clever people understand. But after this, I saw that people kill one another with this historical argumentation, and I went into dialogue initiatives. And by this way, I went into a space of transitional justice, of topics of transitional justice. And I want to say that transitional justice is one of most misunderstandable concepts in Ukraine. And I see some reasons for this, and maybe I will share my thoughts about these. I went into the field of transitional justice not from legal perspective, but from perspective of social reconciliation. And when in Ukraine, it was very popular idea of two Ukraines, and which splitted Ukraine in two parts. And it's split Ukraine into parts with the help of historical argumentation. So we have very popular intellectuals in Ukraine who said, look, this part of Ukraine was under Austrian Empire, and this part was under Russian Empire, and their mental differences are so deep that they don't understand, these two parts don't understand one another just now. And when this concept of two Ukraines was very popular, I saw that it's dangerous, but I was not aware how dangerous it is. And as an opposition, some opposition to this concept, Yaroslav Gritsak proposed 22 Ukraines, not two Ukraines, but 22 Ukraines. And he was maybe the first historian who saw our differences, our regional differences as a resource, not as a problem, but as a resource. And we ought to find our power basing on these differences. So after 2014, we started to think how to deal with this, how to reload our historical narration to go out of these unifying narratives, how to show the resource of our difference and of reconciliation. And we understood that, and we understand now, that the topic of reconciliation is one of the most hard topic for us, because if we imagine that Ukraine will restore its territory, restore its borders, and we will unite all our territories, it will be necessary to speak with people who live there for many years. So now it's 10 years of war, and children who was born in 2014, they are school children now, and they have their own education and their own picture of the world. And we need to speak with these people. And one of the big problems inside Ukraine, before the full invasion, I'm absolutely agree with Thomas that now Ukrainians need to see all things black and white without any hues. But we understand that we need to speak with people who is on that territory. So, and I participated and I saw, observed many wonderful initiatives who worked with this topic, and we had wonderful artistic initiatives and civil society initiatives which established these questions for the society. And maybe if I can share my screen, I will show a couple of pictures. Yes. So one of the projects, I will not create a map of the projects, yes, but it's about understanding. It's a project Odysseia Donbass, and it was about the stories about IDPs, people who lost their homes in Donetsk and Lugansk or Crimea, and it was a project about reconciliation of local communities with IDPs. It was one of the lines of splitting society, because local communities were not absolutely happy about IDPs and suspected them as separatists and said, you are guilty that we had such problems, that Russia annexed our territories because you supported them. And it was an artistic project which proposed to local community to see their new neighbors as people who lost their memories, who lost their houses. And they prepared such, they made in-depth interviews with people who lost their houses, and drew such pictures as a children draw something, yes, and invited local people to be guests of these houses. And it was very healing. It was very healing to IDPs and to local communities too. One more initiative which really met a great opposition from Ukrainian society. From my side, it is a wonderful initiative, but not many Ukrainians think so. It's a project who wanted already left. So people in Ukraine thought that people who stayed on occupied territories are separatists. They support Russia, they are our enemies, and we don't want to see them as Ukrainians. And it was, this project is 10 animated films about real stories of people who live on occupied territories. And I especially observed in social media the flows of hate to this project, and they say, you try to explain us that they are good people, that they are victims, but they are enemies. And other way a gesture which was proposed by Oksana Kakhidze, Ukrainian artist, and this is a monument, really monument to her mother, who died on this line of on the border between Ukraine and occupied territories. She lived in Zhdanivka in occupied territory, and Alevtina created a monument to all who died in loneliness on occupied territories. It's real monuments on a cemetery. It's a grave of her mother, but this artistic work, we wrote about it, and it was absolutely supported by Ukrainian society. We especially observed the reactions for the materials about this monument, and all people supported. We saw absolutely nothing hate, because Alevtina proposed a very special way. Let's think about people who died in loneliness on occupied territories. And it's a model of the house. It's a model of the house with these doors. It's a real number, it's real plan of her house. And it was inscription, it's a house which kept you, which didn't allow you to go out. And one more project of Alevtina Kakhidze. It was a project Bruderschaft devoted to the date of unification of Germany in 2020. We collaborated with in this project, and it was a project about unity, and it was a question, look, Germany was united, and for Germany it's a past, and for Ukraine it's a future. Let's think about it. And so we saw many projects like these. They had different reactions in society, and really there were state attempts to work with the topic of transitional justice. It was the Center of Peace Development created as a part of Ministry of Reintegration, and the questions of transitional justice developed in this center before the full-scale invasion. And now this center is, it exists, but as far as I know, it works with the problems of prisoners of war, and it's not transitional justice on agenda. And now I will come back to the beginning of my my report. I said that transitional justice is one of the most misunderstandable concepts. We as representatives of Memory Culture Platform Past Future Art, we now work with real memorial initiatives with commemoration, and we met constantly such a reaction. Transitional justice, what are you speaking about? Transitional justice about reconciliation with aggressor. I said, no, it's about reconciliation inside our society. Don't you see the conflicts inside our society? Our main enemy is outside Ukraine. It's understandable, but we have problems inside, and we ought to solve them. And people say, no, 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 it's about reconciliation with aggressor. When we say, no, it's about reconciliation inside society, we listen such argument, let's remind the tragedy in Groza village. when 60 people were killed with a missile, and we know that it was neighbor who organized this strike. Do you ask us to reconcile with these people? They said, no, they are criminals. Transitional justice is about a punishment of criminals too. It's not about this. And I try to understand why we have such a distorted image of this notion of the concept of transitional justice. And I went a very easy way. I went to Wikipedia, and I understood that we have no Ukrainian page in Wikipedia on transitional justice. I checked all three notions: перехідне правосуддя, правосуддя перехідного періоду, транзитивна юстиція. No, we have no Wikipedia article. We have materials in Ukrainian Helsinki group and even in a glossary of past future art memory culture platform, but we have no Wikipedia article. And if our Ukrainian person want to find some information and have no information in Ukrainian Wikipedia, he goes to Russian Wikipedia. And it was a great surprise for me when I really opened a Russian page for transitional justice, understood that Russian page is real part of war, because it describes that the best example of transitional justice for Russian Wikipedia is Adolf Hitler. I was absolutely surprised. I don't understand how they unite Hitler and transitional justice, but they said, look, Hitler is example of transitional justice. His politics takes us to legal nihilism. And if you look in this direction, you go to something like this. So I understood that our people in Ukraine use this material, and they see and they go this way, and they are afraid of this concept because they believe this concept take us to the space of crime. Maybe my time is over, and thank you very, very much. And we are going to our next step. Thank you very much.
Thank you, dear Oksana. It does remind us of all the layers and complexities and how did you say this blurring on the grounds, which happens when we apply the frameworks in work. We have, I promised a short period of time for the presenters to engage with each other. And I wonder if you have immediate questions to each other, but it needs to be somewhat contained within, maybe 7 minutes altogether, no more. I certainly have a few questions myself, but I'd like you to voice each other's thoughts if there are any. Thomas, yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, and just because given the time, I will be quick, but it was really fascinating for me to listen. Regarding the terminology, it's like about transitional justice. It's really interesting. I've seen this in many other contexts, the confusion this term creates. And for example, in Bosnia, the term transitional justice is a no-go. No one wants to speak about this because some say that this has to do with reconciliation. A Bosnian would say, look, I don't want to talk about reconciliation because still Serbs haven't been all prosecuted. We also don't want to talk about reconciliation. So I'm thinking, also looking into the chat box here, one important thing is to find a terminology that covers the question that is there, no? That the society needs to deal with the past, no, or needs to do something. But I think a terminology will need to be found, and that's very difficult in a context, in particular like transitional justice, that is very donor-driven, very Western-driven also. The terminology will come in a way and will need to be used in order to get money, to get project funding, or it needs to be in a peace agreement or so on. So, and there is a gap, no, between the problems with this term at the local level, at the kind of how it will get distorted, and so to say, what will be the demand. So I really, and in Bosnia, they started far too late to think about the terminology. And I think that is really a key topic I've seen elsewhere. And so part of any kind of discussions have to start with how do we define that? No, we need to give it another term, maybe. Yeah.
Thank you. We can go directly to the questions, but Keith, I see you wanted to say something.
Just that I agree completely, Thomas. You know, almost all the language that I mean, the wonderful part of it is that there is a global sense of how some of these terms and what's behind them means, and that can be empowering to really marginalize people in different parts of the world, because they can grab onto that and it has a framework to it. But that inevitably means that it isn't sensitive to local contexts at the same time. So I agree, and I'm not sure what the solution is. And I also think that you know, as academics in the profession of law, as a cognate area, we love to create new words that then and then we push down those old words. Well, that is so, you know, 2010. How could anybody ever think of that? And I think that does a disservice as well to people. So I completely agree with Thomas, but I don't have a solution, because I can see the problems that come up with it. Yeah. So I share your conflicted nature around that term.
Thank you.
If I can, I want to ask my colleagues. I want to ask Thomas, you said about unsuccessful examples of transitional justice. Do you see some successful example?
I see within different contexts successful initiatives, successful ideas, successful approaches. I think we have to move away from saying that this is the best practice example. I mean, we did for years in Europe. Germany is the best practice example around dealing with the past. What we see today, that they kind of find it very difficult to do the remembrance work around the Holocaust together with the remembrance work around or responsibility around colonial past. They struggle a lot because they haven't learned how to discuss or have a dialogue around this. And so I'm really against best practice examples, but I'm very much in favor of highlighting areas where dialogues have been under, because for me, transitional justice is an ongoing dialogue. It's an ongoing discussion. It's an ongoing bringing this back and finding ways to discuss it without polarizing, without politicizing. It's a democratic form of being and establishing a democratic form of dialogue. So that's why I'm very encouraged by, for example, what you say about the project you showed, for example, because they show some form of successes. And I can point to many of those projects in other contexts. I can refer to many of similar initiatives in Bosnia or in other parts of the world. The problem is they're often very marginalized. They're often not seen. They often don't get any recognition. And in the worst case, these initiatives even get, or people who work with them, there are reprisals against them. They are basically persecuted. That's the worst situation. So they don't get any protection, people who engage. And so that's part of the system, no? That you try to undermine people who work on the past and censor, and then they do censorship, no? And with the online, what you mentioned, regarding the online dimension of it, that we see more and more that less people dare to speak out, no? But I see a lot of small successes in community initiatives, project initiatives, civil society initiatives that are very important, I think, but they don't get really the recognition often or are not multiplied.
Thank you, Thomas.
I could just briefly try to answer a little bit of a thought with Oksana. What I think happens too often is that we invest into a particular aspect of transitional justice, whether that's a particular legal apparatus or an economic, and what I think I find inspiring about your work is that, there are artists who could be out front, and that can help move the legal apparatus, and that can help move the social political discourse. So having it, I think transitional justice exists on a spectrum, and some parts of that spectrum are moving forward a little faster than others, and that is actually a healthy thing. We don't want to put all of our efforts into a particular sphere of transitional justice development, and so what I think what you're doing is actually the model that many of us should be looking at to see how we can push the needle further in other spheres.
Thank you. For the sake of time, if you don't mind, let's go to the audience's questions. One comes from Yaroslav Hrytsak, and a question to all the speakers. Could you please provide any specific suggestions, just any, how to apply transitional justice approach to post-war Ukraine, especially in the case of Russian-occupied territories? I know, Thomas, you've addressed a little bit that question, but here it is again for you to reflect on. All three.
Please use, Oksana, you start.
Maybe for post-war Ukraine, I will take the thought of Thomas, because that transitional justice is a constant dialogue, and I think that we have no other way than to provide constant dialogues. And we try to do it now, and we really try to organize dialogues between military people and civilians. So now we're working on one memorial project, real memorial project with a military unit. And we understood that it's very important to provide dialogues between military and civilians, because Ukrainian society now is split by this line too. And we have no way to speak with one another. We can edit wonderful laws, and we can organize wonderful museums, and it will be of no result without this constant and not ending process of dialogue inside society. Maybe it's sounds too common, but really we ought to do it in practice.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Thomas, yes?
I can go, yeah. I mean, I completely agree with Oksana. It sounds really, really banal, but this is really the essence, and how you do that is I think is essential. It hasn't been done in many cases. I think lessons learned from elsewhere, I think, is also something I would immediately put in place, because in other cases that are also in Europe and were recent cases, narrow approaches have led to a lot of disappointment of the victims, and of have not fulfilled the expectations. So there won't be 100% prosecutions. There won't be 100% reparations. Unfortunately, I would wish we would live in a world that lives that text, but there won't be. So the problem is that victims that are led into that will feel extremely disappointed, frustrated, will even face secondary trauma, will give that grievances to their next generation. And I'm thinking that this is really a problem if you don't operate from a comprehensive framework right away. And this comprehensive framework needs to include a legal track because it puts pressure. The ICTY in Bosnia put pressure. It opened doors. It emancipated. It basically created agency among victims. And that's important. They need to say, we can do something. But in parallel, there needs to be other things to be done. There needs to be mental health and psychosocial support. There needs to be forums at the local level that basically create spaces where dialogue can take place, because people will keep continuing. If you don't want them to leave, if they want to continue living in these areas, and if you give them that freedom to live in these areas, you would need to deal with the question of dialogue and so on. So I'm thinking that this comprehensive framework, which I think discussions started in Ukraine around the transitional justice framework. I'm not familiar where this is, but the thing is, I think immediately to think about what's part of a comprehensive framework and to connect that also right from the beginning to dialogues with the EU, and to basically for civil society to bring this into that. There is a monitoring going on around that, and so I'm thinking a comprehensive framework that I would call for, and this has to be developed in an interdisciplinary manner. It cannot be only developed by lawyers. There need to be historians around the table. There need to be civil society. There need to be victims around the table. Victim participation in consultations from the very beginning is very, very important. And that has been left out in other contexts that have been very perpetrator focused. So we need basically a victims community focused approaches from the very beginning. And I think there a lot of lessons have been learned elsewhere that could be replicated in a in hopefully a post war situation in Ukraine.
One of the things that I try to encourage people to think about is there has to be, as you say, the reparations, the holding to account of people who have committed the crimes, who have done the horrors, and that process has to unfold in some way. What I often ask, and I don't want to disrupt that process. I mean, people have the right to feel that anger, and they need to be justice needs to be brought. But what I'll often do is say, what would you like your great-grandchildren? How would you like them to relate to the great-grandchildren of the person who committed this atrocity? Not the people themselves who commit the atrocity, but in 3 generations, when those people are no longer here, what vision do you have? And I think if we ask the people who are the current victims to frame a future in that way, often what we see is compassion and empathy emerge, and that, I think, opens incredible doors that can make things happen for those kind of conversations.
Thank you. I cannot help myself to think out loud along with you, specifically of how complex and unique Ukrainian case is when we are trying to seek and pursue transitional justice. Transitional justice, of course, is an important philosophical pillar relying on democratic values and democratic principles of governance. And we are looking at the country which is currently neighboring a totalitarian state and which is currently investing a lot of resources in manipulating, in particular, that discourse around history, and Oksana was talking about that. So I'd like us to think about that complexity, and with this in mind, I'm actually going to go to a question which is next, and I think partially you addressed this, comes from our Zoom. How would institutions force Russia to pay compensations, reparations? And the history, of course, goes back to post-World War II setup, and Germany in particular in 1945 was defeated totally, and the whole country was invaded. And in the Russian case, it is highly unlikely to force the military takeover, I think. And do we expect that the revolution in Russia needs to take place so that new authorities could take responsibility? Because otherwise, anyhow, I'm not going to usurp this question, but here you are to reflect on that complexity, please, if you would like to.
Maybe it's a main question, because we all understand that Russia couldn't be occupied and we can't go the way of finishing the Second World War. I don't know really. Maybe Thomas is more experienced in legal practices, can say something.
It's a very important question. Not only fascinating is the wrong word. It's an important question, and I mean, I've been looking a little bit into the question of. I mean, there's a lot of discussion around assets. No, I mean, it's kind of, there have been 300 billion assets of the Russian state been seized basically in European and US and Canadian countries, and so the question is, can these they have been frozen. Can these assets be seized? No, because that would basically be something that could be done real. I mean, Russia could be I mean, that's their property, no? that's ultimately their money. Which and so I think the US and Canada are quite open to, and have in the past seized assets and contributed to. And given them those whose rights have been violated. Europe and the EU is much more cautious about this topic, no? Because there are some fears, basically, that if you seize these assets, no one will want to invest in the Eurozone anymore, no? Because like the European Central Bank, for example, has been very cautious about this and says, look, we need to also look at the economic dimension and so on and so forth. But there's a strong moral argument to do so, no? To basically say, look, let's seize the assets and let's give them to the Ukraine. So there, a moral argument could be made. So that's one thing, like what to do with these assets that are not insignificant. They're huge and they could be provided for reparation. The question is whether they would be really provided for reparation, or they would be provided for Ukraine, which is in a state of war also, no, which has a war economy also. So that needs, the Ukrainian state also needs money, and that's not reparation money, but particular. No, it needs to pay its civil servants. It needs to be suddenly the super rule of law country because it wants to join the European Union. You know, so it needs to maintain at a very high level a state apparatus. So is that reparation? If then that it needs military support, no? Could this money be used for military? Is that reparation? What's reparation in the Ukrainian case? I think that's still to be answered by the Ukrainians also, and by the Ukrainian victims, and maybe also, I worked a bit on environmental crimes in the Ukraine, by the Ukrainian environment also. That's the silent victim here, no? I mean, that's also another huge victim of this conflict. Shouldn't there be some form of reparation for the environment, which is so key to the indigenous Ukrainian people also? I mean, that's where their livestock comes from, no? That's basically what they need. So the question of like putting reparation up front also needs to happen in the Ukraine itself. So that I think is a key topic. It's not only that money flows. So that's one thing, the asset question and the discussions around reparation in the Ukraine, which need to start. And then the second question, I think, is around, and that's a very sensitive question, I know, and hopefully I won't upset anyone, but there might be at one stage some form of negotiations, some form of agreement. Unfortunately, a lot of conflicts will be solved by agreements. And so this is a way also to force maybe the Russian hand in such negotiations to provide some form of reparations. So basically one could connect the frozen assets with negotiations to say, look, you get only frozen assets back if you provide some form of reparation. So they could be part of a negotiation process. I'm just thinking out loud, and I know these are all very sensitive topics, but one thing is definitely the assets. The other thing is negotiations where normally reparations are part. Other possibilities are obviously the International Court for Justice. But how do you force the hand of Russia into the International Court of Justice? There are cases between the DRC Congo and Uganda around conflicts where DRC Congo where Uganda has recently paid the DRC Congo some billions in reparations. So there is case law as well. I'm just thinking out loud, but it's a topic that is really interesting.
Thank you. There is another question here which I very much like you to address, and it was sent to us in Ukrainian by Alexander Udot. I'll read it in Ukrainian. Чи може бути предметом перехідного правосуддя злочини Російської Федерації проти української ідентичності? Зокрема, йдеться про примусову русифікацію на окупованих територіях. I'm assuming translation had happened. And if not, I will translate it. Can the forced Russification on occupied territories be considered as crimes committed by the Russian Federation against Ukrainian identity? And can that be a subject matter of transitional justice?
Обов'язково. As for me, surely.
Right. If we're not yet out of time, I will have a couple of more questions, at least one. It comes from Yaroslav Hrytsak. As far as I know, the number of crimes committed by Russian army already exceeds by far physical capacity any court system might have to handle those. How would you suggest to address this issue? I don't know, Thomas maybe, or whoever. Yeah.
Sana, Keith, you want to go first, or?
No. Maybe you.
Yeah.
Thomas.
Yeah, I mean, it's also a dilemma we have seen in other contexts, because the problem is this massive amount of violations. I mean, no court of law is able to process that, not even the most efficient one, you know, and in particular not international courts. International courts will just try a handful of perpetrators, and domestic courts will be overwhelmed, or it will take years and centuries even. No, it's very difficult to prosecute all these crimes. I mean, other contexts have seen some form of compromises around this, or alternatives. The worst is amnesty, no? So that's one spectrum, no? To say, let's amnesty and let's not prosecute some, or let's just prosecute the most heinous crimes, no? So to basically say some of them won't be prosecuted, and then we just focus on the most heinous crimes. The other thing is to have in Africa, for example, we saw very traditional forms of justice mixed with formal forms of justice, where these were in Rwanda, for example, there were these so-called Gacaca trials, where nearly 800,000 perpetrators were tried in very speedy trials in communities. There was a problem with, some said there's a problem with the rule of law because you couldn't appeal, for example, or there were lay judges, but they processed in a very short period of time because their formal justice system was overwhelmed. Huge number of cases. There are other examples in Colombia where specialist jurisdictions have been formed, and where basically also people don't go to trial, but are not convicted, but they will do community services. No, so that's also a combination that has been used in contexts like Bosnia, but also what we will see now in Ukraine a lot is trials in absentia. So there will be, because you won't get hold of all these perpetrators. And so you will see a lot of trials in absentia. So I think the discussion in Ukraine, and I don't know where it stands at the moment, what does it mean to not have the perpetrator there? You could maybe speed up the process and you get some form of judgment for the victim, but without the perpetrator. And that we have seen in other contexts as well. So, but again, comprehensive approaches are important. It's not only criminal justice. I think some form of truth-seeking, reparations, memory work, in addition, will give a feeling of justice or a sense of justice.
Thank you, Thomas. I have one more question, which I'd like to bring up from the audience, and it comes from the co-chair of the German-Ukrainian Historical Commission, Guido Hausmann, possibly referenced in the previous conversation before the last question was addressed. Is there any example in Ukrainian history which would give us orientation towards how perhaps transitional justice, I understand that Guido to mean, could be handled going forward? I actually myself had a thought along those lines, but I will let you, the panelists, to think about it.
Maybe I can remind an example from Odessa history, really, when during after Bolshevik Revolution, it was battles between supporters of Ukrainian state and supporters of Bolsheviks, and in Odessa, and it was a big battle with a big number of victims. And after these, next day, it was a united process of farewell. So, and all the victims were buried together. And it was, but it was not successful attempt, because the next day the battle renewed. But it was such a situation of understanding whether it made something dreadful, and we ought to unite and speak with one another. It was not long. Thank you.
This is an invitation for a longer examination of that your question, Keith. Yes.
So if I could just go back to 2 questions ago about the reparations by Russia. Just one point I think is important to make is that the invasion of Ukraine, you know, Russia caused that, but there's a failure of the international order to have prevented this, to have created a situation where Ukraine would have been safe, where this couldn't have happened. And so I think Canada, France, Britain, America have to all look at how do we reinvest. And I don't mean this in a corporate way, but in a humanitarian way, and in a way that promotes the kind of idea that Oksana and Thomas have been talking about of a Central European notion of who they are and how they want to live in a safe cultural environment. We need to contribute resources to that, because the international order has failed Ukraine.
Thank you, Keith. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I was very happy to be able to accommodate several questions from the audience. We had a very important conversation involving international experts on transitional justice, and I would like to see this conversation going forward in some other ways. So I'm very much, I would like to thank you, the participants today, in sharing your thoughts and opinions. And I'm looking forward to continuing this dialogue in some other ways, as I've mentioned. Thank you to our audiences who were hampered by various circumstances. There's a public transportation strike in Germany. There's some shutdowns due to the attacks in by Russia on Ukraine of internet connections. These are the reasons why we may have had fewer people in the room, which are also related to a conversation we're having. So goodbye until next meeting. Stay well.
Thank you very much. Thank you.